I have worked many cases in my life, but few haunt me the way the Poughkeepsie disappearances did. When the first reports came in during the fall of 1996, no one in law enforcement knew we were standing at the edge of a 2-year nightmare. 8 women would vanish in total, each one slipping into the night without a trace, each one swallowed by a predator who walked among us unnoticed. This was the kind of case that tested every instinct a detective possessed, the kind that forced us to confront not only the killer but the failures of the system meant to stop him. Poughkeepsie was not a city that made national news at the time. It was a small ribbon of New York State life pressed against the Hudson River, a mix of old brick buildings, quiet neighborhoods, forgotten industrial zones, and the occasional hum of college life from Vassar. It was the kind of place where people assumed terrible things happened elsewhere. When a woman disappeared, the town shook for a moment, then settled back into its routine. But in 1996, that routine began to crumble. The first woman who disappeared was not someone the public cared about, at least not enough to sustain attention. She was a sex worker living on the edge of poverty, surviving night by night. When she vanished, most people assumed she had moved, overdosed, or simply drifted away. The second disappearance came weeks later, then a third. At this point, even the officers most familiar with the troubled areas of Poughkeepsie felt a chill creeping into their conversations. These women had different backgrounds, different habits, but they shared one thing. They all worked in the same fragile economy of the streets. I remember the first night I walked through the district where the disappearances were centered. Rain had just fallen, leaving the pavement slick and reflective like a black mirror. Neon signs flickered above bars and motels, casting pale halos onto the sidewalks. Somewhere in that darkness, someone was hunting. I could feel it in my bones. This kind of predator was patient, deliberate, and intimately familiar with the ecosystem he preyed upon. My interviews with locals painted a picture of a community fraying at the edges. Sex workers spoke in low voices, glancing over their shoulders, as if expecting to vanish next. Many had seen a large man roaming the area occasionally, someone who kept to himself, someone people tended to avoid because of his overwhelming body odor. No one knew his name at first. They only called him the Stinky Man. Gossip in the district is never reliable evidence, but it hinted at a truth we would later confirm in the worst possible way. The missing women were part of what we in law enforcement called an invisible population. When someone living a stable middle-class life goes missing, the alarm spreads fast. When a sex worker disappears, the silence that follows can last months. That silence was the killer's shield, and for nearly 2 years, it protected him completely. As the disappearances continued, the internal mood within the department shifted. We began holding weekly briefings, reviewing every detail: last known locations, associates, patterns of movement, financial histories, phone activity, criminal reports. Most of the women had experienced violent encounters before. Many struggled with addiction. All were vulnerable. A killer could take them with minimal resistance, and if that killer knew how to blend in, he could keep doing it indefinitely. Every detective senses when a case is gaining momentum and when it is stagnating. This one felt like sinking into wet concrete. There were no bodies, no crime scenes, no physical evidence. Every lead dissolved by the time we followed it. But something about the rhythm of the disappearances told me the killer was local. He was not traveling. He was not hiding bodies far away. He was anchored to this town. That meant he had a place where the women were taken, a place that concealed 8 disappearances without a word leaking out to the public. There is a moment in every major investigation when a detective realizes that the truth is not just horrifying but close. It sits just beyond the boundary of what we assume is normal. For us, that moment began when a surviving sex worker told us about an encounter with the Stinky Man. She said he had grabbed her unexpectedly, squeezing her throat with surprising force. She managed to escape only because a passing vehicle startled him. She described him so vividly that I could see him in my mind even before we learned his identity. Large, heavy, emotionless eyes. A man whose smell arrived before he did. A man who seemed indifferent to personal hygiene and indifferent to the world around him. When the name finally reached our desks, it landed with a weight I could feel in my chest. Kendall Francois, a local man, a former soldier, a school maintenance worker, a son living with his family in a house that had already been the subject of complaints about foul odors. At first, we thought the complaints were unrelated. Many homes in older neighborhoods had plumbing issues or mold problems. We told ourselves that we wanted to believe it, but the truth rarely aligns with what we want. It aligns with what it is. In early 1998, we visited the Francois residence for the first time. I remember the moment I stepped into the hallway, a wall of air struck me with such force it felt physical. The odor was unlike anything I had ever encountered, decay, rot, dampness, and something else, something unmistakable to any investigator who has ever stood near a body that has decomposed for weeks. We asked the family about the smell. They appeared uneasy but not alarmed, which was almost more unsettling. They told us the house had plumbing problems. They said they had grown used to it. To this day, I still cannot fully comprehend how someone could live in a place where death hid in the walls without recognizing it. Perhaps they refused to see it. Perhaps denial was their only shield at the time. We lacked evidence to search deeper. The visit ended without confrontation, but my instincts were ignited now. This house was not simply unpleasant. It was wrong. Every trained sense in my body told me the same thing. Death was inside. Over the next months, we sharpened our focus on Francois. We watched him. We monitored his routines. We looked at every missing person's last known movements and mapped them against his. The locations overlapped repeatedly. We interviewed additional sex workers. They described the same man, the same odor, the same behavior. It was not enough to arrest him, but it was enough to know we were circling the right target. By the time we finally confronted him, the investigation had reached a quiet, heavy tension. The air felt thick whenever we drove past Fulton Avenue. We knew the house held answers. The only question was how many. When Francois sat across from us in the interrogation room, he did not look like a killer in the traditional cinematic sense. He did not smirk or brag or taunt. He was calm, almost blank. His eyes carried the kind of emotional emptiness that chills you more than anger ever could. He spoke politely. He tried to explain away the accusations, but every word felt like a stone sinking into deep water. Then the crack appeared, and when it did, the truth poured out of him with terrible simplicity. 8 women, all killed by strangulation, all taken to his home, all left inside the very walls, attic spaces and crawl areas where the smell had been our first silent warning. That was the moment Poughkeepsie stopped being a quiet town. It became a graveyard no one had known existed. This was only the beginning of the story. And as I stood outside the Francois home the night the search team entered, I understood we were about to witness one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the history of New York State. The kind of scene that embeds itself into your memory forever. the kind that never stops smelling, the kind that makes even seasoned detectives confront the darkest corners of human nature. And this is where the real investigation begins. I have walked into many crime scenes in my life, but none prepared me for what waited inside the Francois residence when the full search finally began. It was late evening, the kind of cold New York night where your breath fogs before your face and the air feels thin with anticipation. I remember standing on the sidewalk, watching the forensic team put on their Tyvek suits under the glow of portable floodlights. The neighborhood was silent except for the faint hum of generators and the static of police radios. There was a sense among all of us that the true horror of this case had only just begun to reveal itself. When the team entered the house, the smell pushed outward as if the building itself exhaled. Even standing several feet back, I felt my stomach knot. The odor was so dense it clung to the inside of your throat. People imagine the smell of death as something sharp and bitter, but what hit us that night was layered, almost suffocating. Days of decomposition, weeks, months. Fatty acids breaking down, tissues liquefying, air that had been trapped with decaying bodies, circulating for the first time in years. Crime scene investigators are trained for this, but training does not prepare you for a house where death is not isolated but multiplied. I watched the investigators move through the front door, their flashlights cutting thin beams through the dark, cluttered interior. The Francois home was in disarray. Trash littered the floors. Clothing lay piled in corners. Rotting food had turned into dark stains on kitchen counters. It was not merely unclean. It was collapsing from the inside, a physical manifestation of everything we feared was hidden there. At first, the team inspected the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs as two investigators descended, their boots creaking on the wooden steps. They disappeared into blackness except for their lights. Seconds later, the radio crackled. Their voices were tight, controlled, but the tremor underneath was unmistakable. They had found something. I followed them down, feeling the temperature drop with each step. The basement ceiling was low, the air stagnant. A mattress lay on the floor, stained beyond recognition. Boxes had collapsed in on themselves. And in the far corner, tucked behind a rusted boiler, the first remains appeared. They were not intact. Decomposition had already claimed most of the form. Forensic specialists moved forward, documenting every inch, their breathing audible through their masks. What struck me was the casual placement. It was as if the body had been set down and forgotten, as though the killer had viewed the corpse as no more consequential than discarded furniture. But this was only the first. The second set of remains was found in the attic, and then a third wedged behind insulation, and a fourth concealed inside a crawl space accessible only through a panel that most people would not even notice. It felt as though the house itself was surrendering its secrets, one grim discovery at a time. Each corpse told a different stage of decomposition, as if marking the passing seasons of the killer's violence. Some had been there for months, some for nearly 2 years. Some were barely identifiable as human remains. As the forensic team cataloged the discoveries, I stepped into the small upstairs hallway. The structure creaked with every movement. The wallpaper had bubbled from moisture. A sour film coated the walls where fluids had seeped down. A single bare light bulb hung overhead, flickering when the wind outside pushed against the fragile window panes. I felt as though I was walking inside the mind of a man whose understanding of death had eroded long before he ever took a life. Nothing in this house suggested panic or remorse. It was the dwelling of someone who had grown comfortable living alongside corpses. Throughout the night, we moved from room to room. Investigators crawled through tight spaces, peeled back wall panels, opened storage containers, and shoveled through piles of debris. Each discovery came not with a shock, but with a heavy, devastating certainty. We knew there were 8 victims. By the time the 7th set of remains was found, there was no relief, only resignation. And then, finally, the 8th emerged from beneath layers of compacted trash and clothing in a small side room. 8 women, hidden in corners and cavities of a house that had pretended to be just another aging home in a quiet neighborhood. While the forensic team worked, I stepped outside for a moment of cold air. I needed it. The smell follows you even outdoors, lingering in your hair, your clothing, the back of your throat. A few officers were standing near the perimeter tape, staring at the house with the same expression I felt tightening my chest. None of us spoke. Some scenes do not allow conversation. They only allow silence. As dawn approached, the bodies were carried out one by one. Each was placed into a black bag, tagged, and carefully loaded into the forensic van. The visual weight of it all was overwhelming. 8 bags, 8 lives, 8 wives, 8 women who vanished so quietly that their absences barely stirred the town. Watching their remains removed from that house, I felt an anger I rarely experience in the field. Anger not only at the murderer, but at a community that had failed these women long before Francois ever laid his hands on them. Inside the house, the deeper psychological portrait of the killer began to take shape. The disorder was not random. It was functional chaos. Francois did not bother to bury or disguise the bodies. He hid them only as much as necessary to continue living in the same house. This was not the behavior of a man who feared being caught. It was the behavior of someone who existed in a psychological vacuum, someone for whom death was not an intrusion, but a natural extension of his environment. He lived among the bodies the way other people lived among furniture. They were simply part of the architecture of his private world. As I walked through the rooms once more before the team sealed the house, I tried to imagine the mindset of a man who carried victims up these stairs, into these tight corners, into the suffocating attic. I tried to imagine the moments after each killing. Did he sit in the living room while a fresh corpse lay overhead? Did he eat dinner while decomposition settled into the wall? Did he sleep knowing that the house around him was slowly turning into a mausoleum? The answers were inside him, not the walls. And I knew that when I returned to the interrogation room, I needed to extract the truth, not just of what he did, but why he embraced this ritual of suffocation and decay. We returned to the station at noon, each of us exhausted. The documentation from the house filled several binders, photographs, evidence logs, diagrams, autopsy preparations. This was not a crime scene. It was a timeline of madness carved into the structure of a suburban home. When Francois was brought into the interview room again, he sat hunched forward, hands folded, eyes cast downward. He looked smaller than he had the night before, not physically, but in presence, as though the weight of what had been uncovered had finally seeped into him. I sat across from him, letting the silence fill the room before I began. I asked him about the house. I asked him when the first body entered it. He answered without hesitation, as casually as someone discussing old clothing they no longer needed. His detachment was chilling, but it was also revealing. This was a man who did not see death as something to fear or hide. He saw it as something inert, something manageable, something he could place behind a panel or beneath a pile of debris and then walk past without a flicker of conscience. As the interview went on, he described each killing with the same monotone calm. He said there were arguments. He said he became angry. He said he strangled them. He said his family did not know. Whether that last part was true or a convenient illusion remains something I still ponder. What struck me most was that he never tried to justify what he did. He simply stated it, as if reciting events that bore no emotional connection to him. It reminded me of men I had interviewed in the past who committed atrocities in war and later spoke about them with the same numb clarity. Francois carried that same hollow center. By the time the confession ended, the air in the interrogation room felt heavier than the house itself. There was a moment when he stopped speaking and simply stared at the table. I do not know what he was thinking. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Perhaps he finally felt the weight of 8 women pressing against him the way they had pressed against the walls of his home for years. When I stepped outside the station, the afternoon sun was too bright. The world felt too normal. People walked down the street unaware that the single largest crime scene in Poughkeepsie history had just been exposed. They did not know that 8 women who had walked these same sidewalks now lay in the county morgue. As a detective, you learn to separate your emotions from your work. But cases like this make that separation impossible. As I stood there, watching life go on, I understood that the true tragedy was not only what Francois had done, but how invisible his victims had been to the world around them. And this was only the second act of a much darker story. There is a moment in every major investigation when the physical evidence stops being the driving force and the psychological landscape becomes the path forward. After the bodies were removed from the Francois home, after the house was sealed and catalogued, after every corner of that rotting structure was documented, we entered the phase of the case that demanded something different. It demanded understanding, not sympathy, not justification, understanding, because without understanding the mind of a predator, the facts remain nothing more than disconnected fragments. To grasp what truly happened in Poughkeepsie, we had to enter the mental terrain of Kendall Francois, a man whose quiet exterior masked something far more turbulent and grotesque than anyone around him ever imagined. Interviews with people who knew him painted a picture full of contradictions. Teachers described him as polite, though disinterested. Classmates said he was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of student who drifted through hallways unnoticed. Military colleagues recalled him as someone who followed orders but struggled with discipline, cleanliness, and emotional expression. His supervisors at the school where he worked in maintenance remembered him as strong, capable, but socially distant. The most consistent comment anyone ever made about him was about his smell. That part of his identity had followed him everywhere. It was as though the scent that clung to him foreshadowed the darkness he would one day embrace. But underneath those surface impressions, deeper questions remained. How does a man living with his family kill 8 women in the same house without detection? How does someone hold a job, greet neighbors, attend family dinners, and simultaneously build a mausoleum around himself? How does a human mind fracture in such a way that death becomes an ordinary backdrop, something no more alarming than a stain on a wall? To answer those questions, we needed to return to the interrogation room. In cases like this, the killer's own words often reveal more than the crime scene ever could. The crime scene provides the structure, the facts, the timeline. But the words of the killer show the internal architecture, the unseen corridors where motive intertwines with pathology. When I entered the interview room that evening, Francois sat with his hands folded and his shoulders slumped. His posture was not defensive. It was almost resigned, as if he knew that the layers of secrecy surrounding his life had been peeled away, and he was now standing in the raw, exposed under the weight of his own deeds. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air vent. He kept his eyes fixed on the table. I started with simple questions. When did the killings begin? He answered with no hesitation. He gave dates that matched our timeline almost exactly. He described his encounters with the victims with clinical detachment. He did not linger on details, nor did he try to hide them. It was as though he was recounting events that had no personal meaning to him beyond their sequence. He did not speak of rage or passion. He spoke of irritation, of arguments over money, of sudden impulses. His explanations were too neat, too incomplete to fully capture the violence he had inflicted. But what struck me more than his answers was the absence inside them. His words had no emotional contour, no guilt, no pride, no internal conflict, just hollow recounting. I had seen men lie to protect themselves. I had seen men lie to manipulate investigators. But Francois was not lying. He was describing a world that made perfect sense to him, a world where human life could dissolve into the background of daily existence without causing disruption. There was a moment when I asked him how he managed to live in the house with the bodies. His answer came without a pause. He said he avoided certain rooms. He said he did not think about it. He said he learned to live with the smell. That was all. No explanation for why he did not fear discovery. No acknowledgement of the grotesque reality he inhabited. To him, death was static. It did not threaten him. It did not haunt him. It simply was. This emotional flatness, this uncanny distance from his own actions, is a hallmark of certain offenders whose psychological fragmentation runs deep. It was as if Francois had severed the connection between action and meaning. The act of killing registered, but its implications had evaporated from the circuitry of his mind. In his worldview, the victims existed only in the moments before death. After that, they became objects, inert and inconsequential. But the human mind is not a simple machine. Even when someone appears devoid of emotion, the truth often hides in the seams. It reveals itself through inconsistencies, pauses, subtle changes in posture or tone. So I watched him closely as I asked about the moments following the killings. Where did he place the bodies? How did he move them? What did he do afterward? It was during these questions that something shifted. He became more guarded. His answers grew shorter. He looked away more often. The idea of handling the bodies seemed to touch a part of him that was not entirely numb. Perhaps there was shame buried beneath his calm exterior. Perhaps there was fear. Or perhaps the act of moving the bodies carried a heavier psychological weight than the act of killing itself. The human brain reacts differently to different stages of violence. Killing, for some offenders, is a moment of release, a moment of control, a culmination of internal turmoil. But disposal invokes something else entirely. It invokes permanence. It transforms the act from impulse to decision. When Francois described killing, he spoke as though narrating an accident. When he described storing bodies in the attic, the crawl spaces and the basement, his tone tightened. That tightening told me more than his words ever could. After several hours of questioning, we stopped for the day. There is a limit to how long a meaningful interview can continue before exhaustion erodes clarity. As I walked him back to the holding cell, I considered the strange duality within him. He was monstrous in his actions, but strangely passive in demeanor. It was not the aggression of a predator that fueled him. It was the indifference of someone whose emotional life had emptied out long before the killings began. Over the next weeks, forensic psychologists conducted their own evaluations. Their findings painted a portrait that aligned with what we saw in the interrogation room. Francois showed signs of long-term emotional detachment, struggles with self-perception, and difficulty forming meaningful relationships. He exhibited elements common in offenders who dissociate during acts of violence, carving a mental divide between intention and consequence. To them, the victims are not people, but ephemeral presences that exist only until the moment they stop breathing. Some might call this evil. Others might call it illness. But for investigators, neither word is particularly useful. What matters is understanding the behavior well enough to prevent its repetition. And understanding Francois meant understanding how he lived his daily life while harboring the bodies of his victims within the walls of his home. His family's presence adds another layer of psychological complexity. How does a man commit repeated murder under the same roof as his mother, father, and sister? The answer lies partly in the physical structure of the home and partly in the dynamics within the family. Interviews revealed a household where communication was strained, where tension simmered beneath the surface, where denial served as a coping mechanism long before the murders began. The family admitted to noticing the smell, the clutter, the decay. They created explanations that allowed them to look away. Humans do that more often than we'd like to admit. When reality becomes unbearable, the mind builds barriers to protect itself. But denial has a cost, and in this case, the cost was the loss of 8 lives. While psychologists worked on their reports, we began constructing a detailed timeline of the killings. The pattern revealed something significant. The murders were not spread evenly across the years. There were bursts, clusters of violence, followed by long stretches of stillness. This suggests internal triggers, emotional cycles, or situational stress. Understanding those cycles helped us reconstruct the internal pressures that shaped Francois's choices. One particular stretch of time stood out. During the period when 2 killings occurred close together, Francois had lost a job temporarily due to hygiene complaints. He had also been in financial distress. Neighbors recalled him looking more agitated, more withdrawn. Stress often amplifies hidden impulses. For some people, it leads to drinking or isolation. For others, to violence. For Francois, those stressors may have pushed him over the edge, fueling impulses he could not suppress. The deeper we went into his psychological profile, the clearer it became that Francois did not fit neatly into any established category of serial killers. He lacked the sadism of some offenders. He lacked the grandiosity. He lacked even the organization typical of methodical predators. His killings were spontaneous rather than calculated. His disposal methods were careless, even reckless. Yet he maintained enough control to avoid detection for years. He lived in a paradox. He was both chaotic and stable, both impulsive and routine, both visible and invisible. A man who straddled 2 worlds and belonged fully to neither. As investigators, we often look for motives that can be summarized in clean phrases: jealousy, revenge, lust, control. But some offenders carry a motive too amorphous to name. They kill because the psychological architecture within them has failed. They kill because they have lost the internal mechanisms that govern empathy, fear, and restraint. They kill because, in their private world, the line between life and death has lost meaning. As the weeks passed, The case file thickened. Autopsies began returning partial results. Some bodies were too decomposed to establish exact causes of death, though manual strangulation remained the strongest indicator. Toxicology was often impossible. Dental records, bone structure, and fragments of jewelry became the primary tools for identification. Family members of the victims came forward to provide DNA samples, photographs, descriptions of piercings, and tattoos. Reconstructing those identities was painful work, but necessary. Each woman deserved more than a case number. She deserved her name back. During this phase of the investigation, I met with several of the victims' families. Those meetings carried an emotional weight that no crime scene ever could. They shared stories about daughters, sisters, mothers. They spoke of hopes lost, of years spent searching for answers, of grief that had calcified into quiet endurance. These families had been living with uncertainty for months, sometimes years. Now the truth had come, but truth is not always a comfort. Sometimes it is another wound. Each time I walked out of one of those meetings, I felt the case settle deeper into me. The victims were no longer invisible. They had lives, histories, laughter, mistakes, dreams. They were not defined by their struggles or their professions. They were human beings whose lives intersected tragically with a man who saw them as expendable. The more I understood them, the more I understood what the investigation demanded. It was not enough to document the crime. We had to restore the narrative that Francois had stolen. 8 women had vanished into a house that tried to erase them. Our job was to make sure they were seen again. As the psychological picture of Francois crystallized, the final stages of the investigation approached. Prosecutors prepared their case. The community began to confront the magnitude of what had been hidden among them. The media arrived. The house became a symbol of horror. People who had once walked past it without noticing now stopped and stared. They treated it as something alien, something monstrous, something separate from their lives. But the truth was more difficult. The house had belonged to the community long before it became a crime scene, and the silence that surrounded its horrors had been a shared one. In the quiet moments, after long days of interviews and evidence review, I often thought of the victims walking into that house for the first time. I imagined the threshold, the dim rooms, the stale air. I imagined the moments when they realized something was wrong. Those thoughts lingered, not as images, but as weight. The weight of 8 stories interrupted abruptly, without dignity or closure. In the end, the mind of a quiet predator is not defined by spectacle or theatrics. It is defined by absence. Absence of empathy. Absence of connection. Absence of the boundaries that hold most of us back from darkness. And that absence created a void that consumed 8 lives. This was the psychological heart of the Poughkeepsie case. A case not driven by complexity, but by vacancy. A case that forced us to confront what can happen when a man loses the internal mechanisms that tether him to humanity. And now, with the psychological foundations in place, the investigation moved toward its final chapters. But the story of how the community responded, how the legal system handled the case, and how the shadow of Francois lingered long after his confession belong to the next phase of the documentary. In every major case, there comes a moment when the investigation shifts from internal discovery to public reckoning. For months, we had lived inside the walls of the Francois case, immersed in evidence, interviews, and psychological dissection. The world outside remained largely unaware of the magnitude of what we had uncovered. But that silence could not last. When the district attorney prepared to file charges and the details of the confession were shared beyond our closed rooms, The story erupted into the community with a force as jarring as anything we found inside the house. The press arrived first. Reporters gathered outside the station, their cameras pointed at the entrance, waiting for any scraps of information. News vans lined the street. Journalists shouted questions about the victims, the killer, the house, the failures of the system. For a long time, we could not answer them. The investigation was active, delicate, requiring precision rather than speculation. But the pressure was building. When the district attorney finally held the first press conference, the truth hit the public like a shockwave. 8 women, 8 bodies hidden within a single home on Fulton Avenue. A local man, a former soldier, a school employee, a family living upstairs, while the walls absorbed the silence of death. The community reacted with a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and a deep, unsettling sense of guilt. They asked how such horrors could hide in a place so familiar. They wondered how many warnings had been missed. They questioned their own instincts, realizing how often they had dismissed the smell, the strange behavior, the missing women who had drifted into oblivion without the world noticing. But the truth was complicated. Justice is rarely neat, and the path toward accountability would be shaped not only by evidence but by the emotional tension now gripping the town. Inside the station, the atmosphere shifted as well. We now had prosecutors, state officials, and federal observers walking through our hallways. Every decision, every interview, every piece of evidence was scrutinized. We prepared for trial even as multiple layers of the case remained unresolved. Autopsies continued. Identifications progressed. Psychological evaluations were analyzed. At the center of it all sat Francois, quiet and expressionless, a man who had unleashed devastation without fully understanding the scope of what he had done. The community wanted answers. They wanted explanations. They wanted to know why. But in many ways, the why was the most elusive part of the entire case. Francois did not fit the image of the calculating predator, nor did he resemble the explosive, rage-driven killers who often leave chaos in their wake. He was something else, something in between. Someone whose emotional disconnection had grown so vast that it created a vacuum powerful enough to erase 8 lives. The legal proceedings began with formal charges, each one representing one of the women whose life had been taken. The courtroom was filled with tension. Families of the victims sat together, many holding hands, others staring straight ahead in silence. Reporters filled every available seat. Even seasoned officers felt the weight of the moment as Francois was led into the room. He did not look at the families. He did not look at us. He simply sat down and stared forward, as though the proceedings unfolding around him were happening behind a pane of glass. His detachment was so profound that it cast a sense of unreality over the courtroom. It was hard to reconcile the quiet man in shackles with the horrors we had seen inside his home. During arraignment, the charges were read one by one. His expression did not change. The judge asked him if he understood. He said yes, but the tone of his voice made it clear that comprehension and connection were 2 entirely different things. He understood the words, but whether he understood the gravity behind them was another question entirely. The defense entered a not guilty plea at first, citing mental health concerns and the need for further evaluation. This was expected. In a case of this magnitude, no attorney would ever rush a plea, but the emotional reaction from the families was immediate and raw. Some cried, some shook their heads in disbelief. Some stood up and walked out, unable to share space with the man accused of destroying their children's lives. Once the arraignment ended, our work entered a new phase. Now the focus was on building a prosecutable case. While confession was powerful evidence, it was not the only component needed. Each victim needed to be identified conclusively. Each cause of death needed to be documented to the extent possible. The timeline needed to be reconstructed with accuracy. Every interaction between Francois and the victims needed to be mapped. The house itself needed to be analyzed not just as a scene of death, but as a psychological artifact. We spent long nights reviewing transcripts and revisiting interviews. We created detailed diagrams of the home, marking where each body was found, where fluids had pooled, where fibers and traces indicated the movement of victims. Even after weeks, the smell still lingered in the memory, a phantom presence rising every time we looked at the photographs. Some cases fade with time. This one refused to do so. There were moments of doubt, not about his guilt, but about the completeness of our understanding. Some of the victims were too decomposed to determine cause of death conclusively. Others had injuries that could suggest struggle or could simply be the result of decomposition. We worked with forensic anthropologists and pathologists, all of whom were skilled, but none of whom could reconstruct the full truth from remains so degraded. The sadness of that reality weighed heavily on us. Even in death, these women were denied clarity. While the legal and forensic work continued, the community grappled with its own sense of responsibility. Churches held vigils. Residents placed flowers outside the Francois home, some as memorials, others as gestures of apology for not noticing sooner. Neighborhood associations held meetings about public safety. Schools discussed signs of emotional distress in students. The town of Poughkeepsie was forced into introspection. It was not merely a town that hosted a killer. It was a town that had failed to protect 8 vulnerable women. I attended several community gatherings in those weeks. Some were calm, reflective. Others overflowed with anger. People demanded answers. They wanted to know why the police had not acted sooner, why reports of missing women had not triggered deeper investigations, why complaints about the smell from the Francois home had been dismissed. There was frustration, justified frustration, directed at the gaps in the system. But there were also voices urging compassion and awareness, voices reminding everyone that vulnerable populations often fall through the cracks. The tragedy forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about how society values certain lives over others. One evening, after a particularly emotional community meeting, I walked alone through the district where several of the victims had lived or worked. The neon signs flickered the same way they had months earlier when the first disappearances occurred, the same bars, the same motels, the same corners where women exchanged conversations, whispered through caution. The streets had not changed, but I had. I saw now the fragile ecosystem they lived in, a place where danger was woven into the air and survival often depended on navigating that danger with instinct alone. I thought of the women we had lost. I thought of their last moments. I thought of the fear they must have felt when they realized they had stepped into a place from which they would not return. Those thoughts stayed with me for years. Some cases fade into files. Some become part of your internal landscape. This one carved itself into mine with a permanence that no amount of time could erase. The prosecution eventually offered a plea deal: life in prison without the possibility of parole in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. It was a controversial decision. Some argued that someone who committed such atrocities deserved the harshest possible punishment. Others believed the plea spared the families from the trauma of a lengthy trial filled with graphic evidence and painful testimony. When the plea hearing took place, the courtroom was silent. The judge asked Francois if he understood that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. He said he did. The judge asked if he was pleading guilty voluntarily. He said yes. His voice remained flat, devoid of emotion. There was no apology, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. When the judge accepted the plea, a ripple of emotion spread through the courtroom. Some families sobbed. Others closed their eyes and breathed in deeply. A few stared at Francois with a mixture of sorrow and incomprehension. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but emotional justice is far more elusive. The law can punish. It cannot heal. As Francois was led away for the final time, I studied his expression. It was the same blank mask he had worn from the moment we met him. If he feared prison, he did not show it. If he regretted anything, it did not surface. In some ways, that stoicism was the most chilling aspect of the entire case. The man who had lived among corpses now walked calmly toward a cell that would confine him for life. The sentencing did not mark the end of the case. For investigators, there is never a clean ending. We still had to complete our reports, finalize evidence logs, answer media inquiries, and support the victims' families. The house on Fulton Avenue remained a haunting presence for months. Some argued it should be torn down. Others wanted it preserved as a reminder of the darkness that can exist behind familiar doors. In the end, the decision was made quietly. The house was eventually demolished. Where it once stood there is now only an empty lot. The grass growing unevenly over a space where horror once lived. That emptiness carries its own symbolism. The structure is gone, but the memory remains. The absence speaks louder than the presence ever did. As the weeks turned into months, I felt the case settling into its final place within me. It taught me truths I wish I never had to learn. It showed me the fragility of human life, the danger of silence, the hidden suffering of the marginalized, the devastating consequences of emotional detachment. It forced me to confront the limits of what law enforcement can prevent and what society chooses to see. Even now, years later, when people ask me about the worst scenes I have witnessed, I think not of the bodies in the Francois home, but of the lives erased before they had a chance to be understood. I think of the women whose names were almost lost. I think of the quiet killer who walked among them unnoticed. I think of the smell inside that house and the silence outside it. This was the fallout. This was the fury. This was the reckoning of a town forced to face the shadows it had ignored. And one final chapter remained, the chapter in which the legacy of the case would crystallize in ways none of us expected. Long after the courtroom emptied and the reporters packed their cameras, long after the house on Fulton Avenue was reduced to an open patch of earth, the shadow of the Kendall Francois case continued to stretch across Poughkeepsie and across the minds of those who had lived inside the investigation. Cases like this do not end when the sentencing is handed down. They echo. They return in dreams, in quiet moments, in unexpected flashes of memory. They leave residues in the corners of the mind, traces that resist time and distance. Even now, years later, when I look back on the Poughkeepsie murders, I feel the weight of them settling behind my ribs, as though the investigation never truly ended. The final months after sentencing were a strange mixture of closure and disquiet. The public moved on faster than we expected. News cycles faded. Headlines shifted to new tragedies and new controversies. But for the families, for the investigators, for the forensic teams who had walked through the cramped hell of that house, moving on was not so simple. We remained entangled in the questions that had no answers, the absences that could never be explained, the moments in the timeline that would forever remain blank. One of the things I learned early in my career is that trauma leaves its own architecture. It builds itself into the routines of those who witness it. Some officers began avoiding the downtown district where several of the victims had once lived. Others found themselves lingering longer with their own families at night, suddenly aware of the fragile boundaries between safety and disappearance. A few considered leaving law enforcement altogether. I understood them. Cases like this do not ask permission before settling into you. They simply remain. For me, the lingering presence of the case manifested in quiet ways. Certain smells triggered memories I wished I could forget. Rooms with poor ventilation made me uneasy. Old houses with narrow hallways made my pulse quicken. Most of all, the sound of silence inside a home, a silence so complete it felt unnatural, brought me back instantly to that night when we first walked through the Francois residence. Silence can be peaceful, but it can also be a sign of something deeply wrong. In the months that followed, I found myself revisiting the case file more often than necessary. Some part of me kept searching for patterns we might have missed, early warnings that could have prevented the murders, signals that might have saved lives. I knew this instinct well. It is the investigator's burden, the reflex to comb through devastation in hopes of redeeming something from it. But the truth remained stark and unforgiving. Even with perfect hindsight, there were few moments that could have changed the course of events. Francois existed in a space shaped by neglect, silence, and emotional decay. He lived in a house where boundaries, communication, and empathy had eroded long before the murders began. Still, the more I studied the case, the more I realized that understanding the environment was just as important as understanding the killer. The victims lived in a world defined by instability, addiction, poverty, vulnerability. They walked through lives held together by thin strands of survival. Their disappearances did not trigger urgency because society had not granted them visibility. People notice when someone from the center of a community vanishes. They rarely notice when someone from the margins does. This truth haunted me more than the details of the crime scene. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable reality that serial killers like Francois do not act alone. They operate within ecosystems that allow them to thrive. Ecosystems shaped by indifference, stigmatization, and the slow erosion of empathy. If society cannot see the people who are most vulnerable, it cannot protect them. In the aftermath of the case, reform discussions began. Police departments across the region revisited their missing persons protocols. Systems were improved to track patterns among vulnerable populations. Community outreach programs expanded. Social services received increased support. Some of these changes were direct responses to the failures revealed by the Francois investigation. Others were driven by the emotional pressure of a community unwilling to repeat the same mistakes. But not all lessons were institutional. Some were deeply personal. The officers who had worked the case carried an unspoken bond. We had seen something together that few others ever would, a kind of darkness not found in textbooks or training manuals, a darkness that crept into the edges of your thoughts when the world grew quiet. There is one moment from the aftermath that has stayed with me more than any other. It happened months after sentencing. On a late evening, when I was leaving the station, a woman approached me in the parking lot. She was small, with tired eyes and a soft voice. She introduced herself as the sister of one of the victims. She thanked me for helping bring closure. She said she knew closure was not the right word, but it was the only one she had. Then she asked a question I had spent months wrestling with. She asked if her sister had suffered. I have been asked many difficult questions in my career, but that one carved a space inside me that I have never been able to fill. I wanted to tell her no. I wanted to give her peace. But dishonesty has no place in the kind of truth we were living. So I answered with the only honesty I had. I told her that I did not know exactly what her sister felt in her final moments, but I knew she deserved better than the world had given her. The woman nodded slowly. A tear slid down her cheek, and then she thanked me again before walking away. I watched her leave the parking lot, disappearing into the night like her sister had done years earlier, but this time with a quiet dignity the world had denied. In that moment, I understood that closure is never absolute. Justice is never perfect. What we offer families is not the restoration of what was lost, but the acknowledgement of it. We cannot return their loved ones, but we can refuse to let them disappear again. As more time passed, I found myself reflecting less on Francois himself and more on what his existence revealed. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was not a figure of mythic evil. He was a man shaped by isolation, neglect, and psychological deterioration. His crimes did not emerge from brilliance, but from vacancy. And in that vacancy, he inflicted unimaginable pain. His story served as a reminder that the most dangerous predators are sometimes the ones who move quietly, unnoticed, without dramatic flair or visible rage. Evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Francois eventually died in prison in 2014. Natural causes. No final statement of remorse. No revelations. His death brought another wave of reflection to those who had been connected to the case. Many felt relief. Others felt nothing at all. For me, his death marked another footnote in a story whose true weight rested not on the killer, but on the lives he stole. In the years since, I have walked through countless crime scenes. I have seen the aftermath of violence in every form, but the Poughkeepsie case remains singular, not because of its brutality, though it was brutal, not because of its scale, though it was vast. It remains singular because of the silence surrounding it. Silence from the community, silence from the victims whose voices were lost, silence from the killer who lived among them without ever being truly seen. I think often of the empty lot where the Francois house once stood. Grass grows unevenly. A tree leans slightly, bending toward where the attic once was. Children sometimes play nearby without knowing the history beneath their feet. The lot looks ordinary, quiet, peaceful, but for those of us who remember, it is a memorial of absence, a reminder that evil can take root in the most mundane soil. The legacy of this case, for me, is a commitment to listening more carefully, to seeing those who are unseen, to recognizing the early signals of danger, to understanding that justice is not merely the act of punishment, but the act of witnessing, bearing witness to the lives that were lost, bearing witness to the failures that allowed it to happen, bearing witness to the human capacity for both darkness and resilience. As I close this final chapter in the documentary of the Poughkeepsie murders, I am reminded of something I once heard from an old detective during my early years on the force. He said, "The dead speak, but only if you know how to hear them." The victims of Kendall Francois spoke through the silence, through the scent that seeped through the walls, through the absences in their families' lives, through the void left behind in a house filled with rot. It is our responsibility to listen. Their stories did not end in that house, and neither should our commitment to them. This is the legacy of the case. A legacy carried not by the killer, but by the memory of 8 women who deserved far more than the world ever gave them.